Welcome, everyone. I'm Vince Staley, Executive Director of Media Impact Funders, and I want to welcome you all to our session today, From Stories to Solutions, Media's Role in Philanthropy. And I'm very excited and delighted to be presenting today's program in partnership with the Chronicle of Philanthropy. I'll say more about that in a few minutes, but before we get into our discussion, I just want to offer a few housekeeping kind of points here. It's great to see so many familiar faces and names on the registration list. It's a beautiful day in Philadelphia and in Washington and other places we're aware of. So we might see some people playing hooky, but we're also seeing the Zoom tiles fill up now. So it's great to have you with us. If you want to say hello, say who you are and where you are participating from organizationally, geographically, please feel free to join us in the chat and let us know who you are. And you'll also be able to use that to offer questions. We're going to have a lively two-part discussion today, but we're also going to try to leave plenty of room for comments and questions from all of the collected knowledge among all of our participants as well. And so with that being said, just want to reiterate, I'm just delighted to be doing this session together with our friends at the Chronicle of Philanthropy, especially Stacy Palmer, the executive director at the Chronicle, who was the managing editor when she started the paper in 1988, and I was she hired me as a reporter on the original editorial team way back then. And so if anybody has any complaints about Vince Staley in philanthropy, blame Stacy, because she brought me into this world in the first place. But seriously, it's really wonderful to be able to do this program, such an important program for our field. At Media Impact Funders, we care about the effective practice of making grants for media, all the different ways, journalism, documentary film, all the ways that media supports philanthropy supports media, but we're also implicitly concerned with the effective practice of philanthropy as well. And that's really what the Chronicle of Philanthropy has focused on in all of its time since 1988. And so it's really great to be able to focus on the work of the covering philanthropy at the Chronicle and also their efforts to support that in the wider field of journalism. I do remember from the very first days at the Chronicle that it was virgin territory for the news business. Nobody else was really covering nonprofits and foundations the way they needed to be covered. And so from the very first days, it was not just go get a great story, but also help other news organizations learn how to do a better job of that. And with that maybe preface, I might just invite Stacy to say a few words about the purpose of the Chronicle of Philanthropy and the evolution of that purpose as we come up to the fellowships that we're going to talk about today.
Perfect. Thank you, Vince. And it is really fun to reconnect. One of my favorite things about what reporters who have left us have done is they usually go into the field of philanthropy because they feel frustrated that just reporting on it isn't enough, but they want to go do it and participate in it. And so that's a pretty wonderful byproduct of some of the work we've done. When we got started, as Vince said, nobody was really covering philanthropy in any kind of a serious way. And the field itself came to us and said, we need a professional publication to be able to link folks together. That was before there was an internet to help us all understand things, shockingly enough. And people just didn't have a way to communicate, to know what was going on Capitol Hill that might affect them, how the field was developing and professionalizing. So we focused on that, but we always knew that what was most important was we wanted to prove that this was a field well worth covering, really important in every community, and it just wasn't. There have been these periods, those of you who have been in philanthropy for a while know, that's gone up and down. During the tech boom times, all of a sudden, when there were a lot of glitzy big gifts, all of a sudden it was really important to cover philanthropy, and you saw a bit of coverage, but it just hasn't been sustained. So one of the things we've always wanted to do is make sure we could do more to encourage coverage of journalism. And so we've done that in a couple of ways. Would you like me to talk a little bit about that?
Please, yeah.
Okay. During the pandemic, we were really examining, what is our purpose? Why are we here? Just like everybody else was. And one of the things we did was we reached out to the Associated Press and forged a partnership with them and a group called The Conversation, which some of you may support and know. It takes scholars and makes their work really accessible and runs them in other publications. So we came together, and the Lilly Endowment decided to support us with a grant that allowed all of us to hire more reporters and editors who would focus on covering this field. That was tremendous. Those of you who know how few philanthropy reporters are, all of a sudden there was an army of 5 or 6 additional people covering this field, which was huge. But we still knew there was a gap in covering local news, and local is where so much philanthropy happens and where there can be so much impact on, what donors are doing, what volunteers are doing, how policy is made. And so we wanted to get at that issue. So we decided to create a fellowship program where we would work with local news organizations. We pick 4 of them every year, and we work with them all year long. In philanthropy and in journalism, there's a lot of sort of one-hit efforts. You go to a conference, you learn about something, you do something, and we wanted to get away from that. And that idea of sustaining it and providing coverage and coaching and helping people throughout the year was something we thought had promise. We're now in the 3rd year, and we're seeing that it truly has.
Okay, so a couple things. One is, we started talking about doing a session like this probably 2 or 3 years ago, when it was an idea and in the first days. And I'm just glad that we're slow sometimes in actually getting our act together, because now you've actually done it for a couple of years and you have some experience to share. And we're going to get into that in a minute. But you also have made a transition from the early days. You were a for-profit enterprise, and you also made a transition to nonprofit status, and partly enabled to be able to do things like this, right? So maybe just a few words
Exactly
on
that.
status.
Yes, so a year and a half ago, we became a nonprofit organization. We spun off from our parent, the Chronicle of Higher Education, which had founded us. So we became not only a nonprofit, but an independent organization, because we knew there was so much more we needed to do to serve the field, and that we weren't able to do it with both the resources and the attention. And the world, any of you who have been in higher education, you might know that the worlds have really, they used to have a lot in common. College presidents became foundation presidents all the time. That was a very frequent thing to do. There was just a lot happening. That's not so much, it's an important piece of the world, but it doesn't happen so much anymore. And so we really knew we needed to be on our own. Becoming a nonprofit means that we can focus much more on impact and mission. And these fellowships, for example, are a really key part of what we want to do. And we're eager to expand them now that we have nonprofit status. And it makes it easier for us to do these things. And we're part of the growing movement of nonprofit news organizations, which I think feel more of a commitment to doing this kind of work than traditional news organizations, albeit the changes that are happening in for-profit as well.
Okay, great. And we have one of the participants in the fellowship program. Do you want to maybe set it up a little bit? We have Steve Killar, Equity Issues Editor at the Arizona Republic. Maybe Stacy, if you want to set up how you engaged in support of Steve's work, and then Steve will join us as well.
Great. Steve has done amazing work, and the Arizona Republic has done incredible work. So I can't wait for him to tell you more about that. We go through a recruitment and selection process where we work with the Associated Press and the Conversation to pick from zillions of applications that we receive. And the Arizona Republic's work really stood out in terms of what it's done. I think what's excited me most about working with Steve and his colleagues is that they are not in this year's fellowship cohort. They did it last year, and they're still continuing to cover nonprofits. And so I hope you can talk a little bit about not just what they did in the fellowship, but how it's affecting them today.
Great. Well, welcome to the discussion, Steve. And you're joining us from where exactly?
I'm here in Phoenix.
Great.
Yeah, the Arizona Republic's main newsroom is in Phoenix. And I'm so grateful to be here today, and grateful to have been part of the fellowship through the Chronicle Philanthropy program. We were part of the cohort from March of 2023 through March of this year. And the thing I loved so much about this program was that it really did give us new skills that have spread throughout the newsroom and infused at least my team. I have a terrific team that covers a variety of topics. And we initially got involved in this to continue our work on affordable housing coverage. But since then, really have spun out our coverage of philanthropy into other areas that my team works on. I'll show you a little bit about that, but I just wanted to start out by talking about why we got involved in the fellowship, and I think why it's so important to continue fellowships like this. I was really looking for opportunities for professional development for my reporters. One of the best ways as a manager to keep people engaged is to keep them learning and growing, right? And I knew that as soon as I saw this fellowship call, that this was a great opportunity for the people on my team to be able to continue to expand their skills. And it's just a terrific testament, I think, to this fellowship that, it has spread out throughout the newsroom, but it really is a fellowship that supports individual journalists. I mean, some of the journalists that were on the team that worked through the fellowship program are no longer with the Arizona Republic, but I know that they're carrying this knowledge forward to the news organizations where they are now. Some of the benefits of the fellowship that I really appreciated were the nationwide community of reporters it was a community of learners all together throughout the course of the year. We were seeing what other newsrooms were doing, how they were picking up on what they were learning. And we were also just, expanding our own professional networks. During our fellowship year, it was us here at the Arizona Republic, the Boston Business Journal, the Post and Courier, and WHQR in Wilmington. So it was a really great, diverse set of fellowship participants. Another, aspect of the fellowship that was really beneficial to us was the 4 remote training sessions where we all came together as a fellowship class and heard from experts on different issues. During our fellowship year, the main training sessions were the orientation, which I found incredibly helpful, which is really why reporting on philanthropy is so significant. And I take a lot of what we learned into my daily work during that session. I mean, this session would have been well over a year and a half ago now, but we count on nonprofits. They're major employers. People give them money and their time, right? So there's a built-in audience, right, for coverage of nonprofits because people invest in these organizations. We also subsidize them as taxpayers, which resonates with a lot of readers. So it's important for us to assess, right? Just like we are government watchdogs, are they effective? Who are they benefiting? Are they spending the money that they have? And I really benefited from that orientation session, and I know my reporters did too. Beyond that, another orientation session another training session that we've continued to use is just finding and using 990s to your benefit in your reporting. We had a terrific session on solutions journalism. It's an area, that I had some familiarity with as an adjunct professor. We use it in some of our intermediate reporting classes at the Arizona State University's Chronicle School. But my reporters didn't necessarily have that knowledge, and it was really terrific for them. We also had a session on 501c4s versus 501c3s, going into an election year, which was really significant for them. Other benefits, we were paired with a Chronicle buddy. In our case was Eden Stiffman, who had recently done some reporting on affordable housing, which was our topic area. And so she could give feedback to my reporters and, ideas for sources. And that was really beneficial. The funding was obviously wonderful to have, know that we had some funding available to send people on overnight assignments, not only journalists and the reporters, but also photographers. We did use some of the funding for additional professional development conference attendance, which was terrific. The subscription for all the team to the Chronicle of Philanthropy was great because it's this ongoing source of ideas, right, of what we could do locally. And I just loved that, have continued to read the Chronicle of Philanthropy after the fellowship ended. And as I said, I think the greatest benefit for our newsroom and for our readers was great stories, and the fact that the knowledge is spread throughout our newsroom.
If I could just ask you to drill down on a couple points I've heard. One is, it's interesting that resonates that covering this area of activity, which is such a pervasive part of the community, so many people are involved in it. It's actually, I hear you saying that it's actually beneficial for the publication to grow engagement among your readers because you're covering something they have a greater familiarity with and the interest in the stories.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are a lot of nonprofits. One of the organizations that we have reported about, actually it started during the fellowship, although they weren't fellowship stories, was the charitable organization that runs the Phoenix Open, which is, a major golf event. They are a huge charitable organization. They, distributed $17 million this year, if my memory serves correctly. So they're an organization that readers recognize. They know that they do a lot of good work in the community, but they might not know much about the organization itself beyond the fact that it runs this sporting event. And so, we use this fellowship as a launch pad for starting to report on this organization, doing some early reporting about sort of cultural appropriation issues in their organizational structure. Not just that organization, we have a number of these sporting events, nonprofits that, run spring training games, and a lot of them are appropriating Native American symbols and names. So, we've done a lot of reporting on that. That's resonated with our audience for sure. But also, that you think about names on buildings, right? There are a lot of nonprofits that people just see the names on buildings just like they would see a corporation, and wonder what that group is.
Yeah. The other point I wanted to ask you to draw out on is about solutions journalism. I think maybe there's still some sense that that's like, oh, that's the good works, that's the light stories, the sunny stories, what have you. But it's really investigative work in many ways, even if it's looking for what works. I wonder if you could just elaborate on the degree to which those things come together.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I think, and actually, I don't know that I would. The story that's on the screen right now, was our first story that was part of our three-story commitment. We've done a lot more stories beyond that commitment, but this, I think, is an example of, at least it doesn't quite go through the solution. And whoever on this training hasn't been through a solutions journalism network training, they should absolutely do it because it's terrific training. It really gives you a wonderful overview of how you can do investigative work and whether solutions are working, right? Or what solutions are working out in the world that you might be able to bring to your community. And I think this story here that's on the screen is somewhat of an example of, problems that can be created for organizations that are working on solutions, right? I could see us going back to this organization that's going out and interfacing with homeless people and talking about, are their solutions effective themselves? So it's certainly, I wouldn't say we did a particular solutions journalism project through this fellowship, but we definitely have more knowledge now as a newsroom to be able to take that on.
Mm-hmm. And you're carrying it over beyond the parameters of the fellowship itself. It's become now integrated into your practice.
Yeah, so Shannon, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide, I can, these are some examples of stories that we've done post fellowship related to nonprofits that we're continuing to report on. And so we approached the fellowship, we put our application in to report on affordable housing. We were wrapping up a multi-year grant that was funded by the Arizona Community Foundation on affordable housing, which we were incredibly grateful for that generous grant. I do think it really changed the conversation about housing affordability in Arizona. And we were, in addition to professional development for my reporters, I was looking for us to find a way to continue expanding this reporting. One aspect of their reporting that we didn't really do was the nonprofits that support affordable housing. So this gave us a way into that. After the fellowship, we're still obviously reporting on affordable housing issues, but I have since expanded that beyond my housing team into other aspects of my reporting team. I have a reporter who covers the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office. He's written stories now about a nonprofit that is in support of a sheriff's program. After we ran this story about this animal shelter program, that prompted them to conduct an audit, which we'll have a story about coming out about shortly. The organization here, the Thunderbirds that runs the Phoenix Open, we've done now several stories on this organization and have another story coming out about their charitable giving specifically, in the coming weeks. So yeah, it's all continued and it's really enriched our newsroom for sure.
Wonderful, wonderful. I wonder, are there other aspects of the work that you wanted to highlight before we move on?
Let me just look at my notes really quick.
And we may also have questions from participants as well. We'll come back to
I think
as
that
well.
The most significant thing that I want people to remember about this is that it really is a formula for supporting the journalists themselves, right? I know that my reporters and I am taking this information with me beyond our newsroom, right? So as media funders think about, how they're structuring grants, one of the things to think about is how can I strengthen the industry as a whole, right? Beyond maybe one particular newsroom. And that's what I love so much about this fellowship program.
Great. All right. And Stacy, how does it work now going forward? How many, how often, how many, how does it work as a fellowship?
So right now we have funding that allows us to have 4 organizations every year. We would love to expand the program, so we're actively looking to do that. And then another thing we want to do now that we've got 3 years of participants, which means 12 organizations, bring them all together, bring the new fellows that we'll support next year, and have an in-person gathering. That was kind of the plan all along when we started this program, was that we would do more in-person work, and then we started it during the pandemic. So we weren't able to do that. But it's very important that we find ways to keep people connected to each other and also connected to our newsroom. We've got, a cadre of great journalists. Well, I'm so glad Steve talked about the benefits of the buddy he worked with, but the whole organization is helping and coaching along. And so the more we can develop this, there's a professional group of us who are paying attention to nonprofits and bring them together. So that's what we hope to do in the near future. And then we're also looking at whether there are specific areas in the nonprofit world we should focus. Should we look at climate change and, support fellowships in those areas? So we've got loads of ideas for how we can expand this program.
Wonderful. And then conversely, also, it's an exemplary fellowship program, and there are many other journalism fellowship programs. We heard recently from Comcast about a program they have in our monthly journalism funders discussions, and the New York Times has a fellowship for refugee journalists who are out of country and now coming to the U.S. and trying to resettle, really, essentially. So I'm sure you'd be open to talking to folks who are trying to run fellowships and learn from your great experience in running these too. Yeah. Well, one of the other aspects of this work, which particularly in a state like Arizona, which I think is a hotbed of the kind of polarization we're seeing throughout the country, it's an election year, and obviously it's very much on a lot of our minds, is the way in which this helps newsrooms address stories that might otherwise be polarized and polarizing stories, subjects, and really getting a deeper examination of these issues. I just wonder if you could maybe speak to the way in which this fellowship helps to illuminate the issues that might otherwise be the subject matter for that polarization.
Yeah, I think one of the things that reporters don't think about doing until they do something like participate is they don't know the nonprofits that are working on the issues, how to talk to them, how to talk to some of the recipients. One of the fellowships this year is focused on a community that's had an influx of immigrants over the past 10 years. And so they're connecting with the immigrants themselves to talk about how the services have helped, and really trying to illuminate through explanatory reporting what makes a difference. That is such a hot button issue in most of the country, but they're going in and locally. And one of the things they found is a lot of the immigrants who came, say, a decade ago, they're founding their own nonprofits, and they're doing things a little differently and saying, you know, the groups that served us were great, but they didn't know all the things that we really needed, and looking over the long term. So I think if we can have those kinds of stories and help people figure out how they can plug in as well in their own communities, we hope to spark volunteerism, donations, involvement in various ways, because the more people know about nonprofits and what they're doing, they'll get involved. And we know that when people volunteer together, they can put their differences aside, they get to know each other and talk about those things. So those are the things we hope to be achieving through this program.
Wonderful. Well, before we got on with all of our participants, we were just noting that in the early days, in the first year of the operation of the Chronicle of Philanthropy, it was an election year. But in those elections, it was Bush won 1988, and he had 1,000 points of light. And then Bush 2 had all of the work around compassionate conservatism. And it was a time when both parties were committed to community solutions and a much less polarized political environment. And in more recent years, obviously, some of these wedge issues became subjects for polarized debate. And I just wonder if you would say just a word of how you came to the Commons, and then we'll switch over to our other speakers to talk about it.
Yeah. You know, I mentioned that we decided to become a nonprofit after exploring this idea. One of the things I did before that, I wanted to make sure this was a really smart idea and there were needs. So I talked to lots of foundation and nonprofit officials, and the common thing that they said they needed from the Chronicle was a way to deal with polarization. It was such a big problem. It was hampering their work, whether they were foundations or nonprofit executives, and they needed a place where they could discuss what's working, get some tools to deal with it, and just find a way also for philanthropy itself to be able to talk across some of these differences. So they urged us to take a role. And so that idea had been percolating for a really long time. And then we decided it was time, as we got our nonprofit status and we're ready to dig in, that would be the first very big project we do, all focused on one subject area. And we intend this to be a long-term thing. It is not just for the election. This problem's not going to be solved anytime soon. So we're in it for the long haul.
Great. Well, wonderful. And as you shifted from editor of the Chronicle of Philanthropy to CEO of the Chronicle of Philanthropy, you brought Andrew Simon on to be editor-in-chief. And we know Andrew from his previous work at GRIST, and we participated. Andrew was kind enough to participate in person in Boulder and on some of our remote programming during, I think, the pandemic. So welcome back in a different role, Andrew, to share your perspective now. And Faye Twersky will be joining us as well from the Arthur Blank Foundation, where she's president and director. But maybe now you could say just a little bit about the Commons and what it is, and welcome, and share your thoughts, Andrew.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Vince and Stacy and Steve. It's great to see you all. So yeah, you know, Stacy, you just kind of teased out the why of the Commons, but you know, the organization did start the Commons as a way to recognize that polarization and these conflicts in society today they're overwhelming for so many of us, but particularly for leaders in philanthropy and across the nonprofit sector. And you know, I think the endeavor is to really understand what leaders and others are doing to help bridge these divides, and also, you know, frankly, ask some tough questions about philanthropy's role in it all. So in April, which is the same month I started at the Chronicle. The organization launched the Commons. And, in terms of the what, we publish opinion pieces, essays, reported stories, and case studies, kind of all projects that explore solutions from both foundations and nonprofits, and, trying to probe out what works and also what doesn't work. So around the kickoff of the Commons, we launched a few stories. Some of them, we have visual aids here up on the screen. A feature on LB Prevet. She's someone who's working in Appalachian communities and kind of connecting big philanthropy to nonprofits on the ground there. We had a kickoff essay from Darren Walker. I don't think knowing the news that was going to come from Darren Walker, but his essays on how the fight against inequality will save democracy. We also published a story which is, fun and practical, a list of 10 words and phrases philanthropy should retire. A bit provocative. And then more recently, we ran a roundtable with young nonprofit leaders discussing the big challenges that they face today. And I'll note one other thing because it's on the slide here. We, a few months after the launch of the Commons, launched a LinkedIn-specific Commons newsletter, which we've been really excited about, and has quickly gotten to about 27,000 followers. I think we're getting closer to 28,000. So really excited to see the excitement around the newsletter, which I think speaks to what, Stacy was just referring to a few minutes ago, that I think there is a real hunger among leaders, particularly in our sector, of trying to understand how to navigate polarization and what are actionable things to do, right? What are models and things to do, and what are some things to, maybe try to avoid doing?
That's a remarkable uptake for your LinkedIn channel.
It is, and I think it speaks. I might be jumping ahead to where we would go with the Commons, but I think it also speaks to this notion, which the media people on here will be savvy to. It is meeting readers where they are, right? That I think this was a way to through LinkedIn and that audience really tap into the leaders who we think would gravitate towards this topic. And again, as the discussion moves, I can kind of talk to other ways we plan on doing that.
Well, I guess one important place to start with Commons is, when you set up these kind of discussions programs, it might be like an invitation to cheerful, sunny, agreeable topics, but actually the Commons is a place for hard questions and hard conversations, right? And trying to depolarize an environment means you're dealing with hard topics where there are important disagreements about things for which there might be a right and a wrong. But anyway, I just wonder if you'd help navigate the hard questions aspect of it.
Yeah, sure. So, well, I'll say this: through our opinions section and through essays, I do think that is a territory where it is about perspectives and being open to the different perspectives and hearing what people have to say, and being willing to be, let the people not just be provocative, but being open, right, to these different perspectives. But one thing I'll say that's interesting, just in terms of the stories that people are, clicking into, right, based on the page view data, it's actually the reported stories and some of the advice pieces that, at least from a metric standpoint, that the readers are gravitating towards. And I think our hunch there is that, as I'm alluding to, I think our audience is hungry for solutions, right? Like what is happening? What's happening? What are people doing on the ground? What are the ways to navigate these conversations? A more recent story we just ran is can your organization stay neutral on conversational topics? 5 things to know. So I think it's some of these practical solutions that our audience is gravitating towards. And I'm sure the perspectives and the opinions are welcome. And we want to continue to kind of push things that way. But at the same time, I think what our audience is suggesting is that they really want to know, again, the models for success, and also understand, the challenges too, right? Like what are some of the, the failures, and what can people learn from missteps?
Is there an example of a topic that you could maybe get into and say, here's a good example of that, illustrate that point?
Oh, in terms of which point?
Of introducing a topic where the reported story leads yeah.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, no, there's some really fun ones. So, a couple. So there's one where we had our reporter Drew Lindsay, who's an editor, and he's overseeing the Commons, and he deserves so much credit for the launch he pursued a screenwriter who now runs a charity, and the gentleman's name is David Levinson, and he's sort of found ways to bridge divides through volunteerism. And that's sort of the angle through which that he's aiming to bring people together. Another example, and this is another story that Drew Lindsay worked on through Charity Water, the organization a lot of people probably have heard of. You know, what that organization does is they actually lean into controversial topics through their, through their social media, through their digital media presence. And they do it with, a brushstroke of levity too, right? So I think the idea there is that they're, in some ways, I think, courageous in being willing to go there, but I also think they approach it with some levity as a way to, again, get people who are, in their case, their audience, get them to talk about these issues. So yeah, those are a couple examples.
Okay. And before we move on, I just want to reiterate to anyone who's listening in, please, if you have a question, put it in chat. Whether it's for the first part of the discussion on fellowships or the second part on commons, we'll get to them in a few minutes. But I want to, do you have any final thoughts you want to bring to the practice of running the commons before we move to Faye's perspective?
Yeah, and it may segue into Faye a little bit, because I think, Faye, we may have discussed this in our conversation a few weeks ago, but in terms of where we're going with the commons, a few thoughts there. So one, I do think we have the ability to convene people, whether virtually or in person, to have more conversations. So a few examples of that: we have a LinkedIn series of conversations that we're going to launch in September. Stacy and our editor overseeing the Commons, Drew, who I've mentioned a few times, they'll be having a kickoff conversation, and then every 2 weeks from there, we'll be having a LinkedIn conversation. I think in-person events are promising for us too. There was a Council on Foundations event, I believe it was in April or May, that Stacy and others attended, and there was some real energy around the Commons at that dinner. I think people wanted to talk about these issues. They wanted to figure out ways to navigate polarization. So I think that there's a hunger for in-person events. And then the other piece I'll say is we think there's a multimedia opportunity here too. I think some of the funders involved in the Commons, they're interested in video, they're interested in podcasts. Kind of fits in with the LinkedIn newsletter, what I was saying before, in that, how do we go to people where people are, right? How do we reach people in different ways and have more of a 360-degree approach for the Commons? So those are some areas where we'd like to grow.
Yeah. I think one of the participants in your dialogues has been Kristen Campbell from PACE. Is that correct? She led a really fascinating discussion in our most recent Media Impact Forum. Maybe we can post the link to the video of that. But she had a conversation with Nicholas Ma, who's a filmmaker whose forthcoming film, Leap of Faith, addresses the divisions and the effort to bring some sort of unity in the Christian church in America, where it can be very divided and be the seat of division. And so the film goes into an effort to bring Christian pastors, black, white, rich, poor, gay, straight, all different. The Christian church is big enough to include all of these different perspectives, and an effort to through really hard conversations, bring people to some sense of unity and shared value and stuff like that. So another good experience that we've had along these lines too. So maybe we'll go to bring Faye into the discussion. And hey, Faye, great to see you. Faye is the, as we said, president and director of the Arthur Blank Foundation in Atlanta. And she's been, I think, a longtime advocate for pluralism and understanding across division in America's highly polarized sort of culture and politics. So now in your role at the Blank Foundation, you're supporting the Commons here. Tell us a little bit about your perspective on that.
Yeah, my perspective, I mean, we've already talked about this already, Vince, during this first half hour or so. The country is polarized and our sector is polarized. Sometimes people think, somehow we're immune to that, but we're really not immune. And we've got very progressive funders, we've got very conservative funders, we've got all manner of funders. And I would say, as a general matter, we're not particularly good at working together. There are exceptions, groups like the New Pluralists that the Chronicle has featured, and I was involved in the launching of that. But those are really the exceptions. It's very hard for funders to break out of their ideological molds often. And so, yeah, I think I was one of the people that talked to Stacy early on when she was talking to funders about, doing her listening tour and trying to figure out should the Chronicle become a nonprofit, and what should it be, and what's the needs. And then last September, I happened to be in Washington with a couple of colleagues and stopped by to have a chat with Stacy about how things were going at the Chronicle. And we hadn't even been supporting the Chronicle from the Blank Foundation. It was just sort of a check-in, how are things going? And we talked about this need, to really have the Chronicle play this role of, what I would say, what Amanda Ripley talks about, complicating the narrative, of being a place that multiple perspectives are shared, and sometimes competing points of view, and that we all get smarter as a result, and maybe find new ways to work together. So we were really happy to be an early supporter of the Commons.
And is there anything in the coverage in the Commons, any aspect of it that resonates particularly deeply with you?
We don't have journalism. It's interesting. We don't have journalism as a programmatic area for us.
Yeah.
We work on important issues: democracy, climate change, mental health, youth development, Atlanta's West Side. We of course, journalism is important to many of these things, but some foundations have journalism as a core program area. We don't. We have a small budget to help improve philanthropy and to support some philanthropy infrastructure organizations. And it was really out of that that I said, I think this is a really important place for funders read the Chronicle, and there's no other, I would say, central address quite like the Chronicle of Philanthropy. So for me, it felt like a natural place to, how can we improve philanthropy, to actually understand multiple perspectives, different perspectives, sometimes competing points of view, than supporting the Commons. So that's, I would say,
Yeah.
that was the animating purpose, and what I still feel like is the greatest value. On a specific case, though, since you asked specifically, like one of the areas that we're thinking about and planning for is economic mobility for young people in rural Georgia, in rural Montana. And so when I saw the Hillbilly, unfortunately, there hasn't been, I would say, a lot of philanthropy in rural places. And now I would say overdue. There is a little bit more attention coming there. So that hillbilly, the lesbian hillbilly piece, I thought it was a great piece. It made me think differently. It informed me, like, in a kind of real-time way of, how do we not get ahead of ourselves? How do we, as they say in Georgia, take time to drink tea with people and go a little slow. And so anyway, that's just a very specific.
Great. Well, if I could just reflect, one of the things that you talked about was how you're supporting work in a journalism effort organization, but not out of a journalism program. That's actually much more common than I think a lot of people understand. It may be a majority of the work in our field is supporting media expression, journalism, documentary film, all the different ways that philanthropy can support media activities coming out of the program areas and not out of distinct journalism programs. There's only a small handful, frankly, of foundations that have a dedicated journalism program. So I would just say a lot of people on this call might feel like, yeah, we're like that too. A lot of people feel like we're not really part of this field of media philanthropy because we do it out of program. Actually, that is the majority of the people involved. And so everybody should feel comfortable in that's what you're doing and not overstating how big a commitment it is, but it's important work when you support it for those programmatic reasons. And also it's well informed by the programmatic knowledge of what topics need to be covered, what areas need to be supported in specialized journalism. I think today's program is a perfect illustration of that. But I want to bring Andrew back in onto the screen to maybe tease out that LinkedIn community, because I think one of the things that the new pluralists and what people are looking for is to create a community of practice. And what you've said here is like 27,000. I mean, that's a very large beginning of community of practice to have that kind of followership. I wonder if you just say a little bit more about the LinkedIn piece of that community.
Yeah, sure. I would like to say we knew when we launched it was going to have that much momentum from the jump. So it's been a really welcome surprise. But yeah, I mean, again, I think it goes in line with a few of the things that have come up already. I think for one, and this is where it gets a little inside media, but I do think using LinkedIn as a platform is going to where the leaders are, right? We recognize that, as publishers, leaders are busy. Our audience members are busy. They may not have time to, click on every Chronicle newsletter and post and get through it all. But by going to LinkedIn and hosting a newsletter there, we do think that's an effective way to just kind of go to where our readers are and reach them in a more targeted way. So my hunch is that that's part of it. And, I would also say that, again, we're going to have some of these conversations in the coming weeks. And I think we're hoping that it's a way that we can be conversation starters and that these conversations can continue to happen, whether it's through the chat and in these LinkedIn conversations, et cetera. And again, over time, find other ways where we can bring people together to have such conversations. So I would say we're pleasantly surprised, but when you start to think about LinkedIn as a platform, that's where the leaders are. Frankly, social media as a tool, right? People are moving away from X, they're moving away from these other platforms. So LinkedIn seems like a rich area there.
Yeah, I think maybe just going one step further into what are the different characteristics of the different social media platforms and the longer form, expression and maybe the fact that it's a professional development venue invites people to express themselves a little bit differently. They don't have their flamethrowers strapped on and blasting each other with 140 characters of venom. And so I just wonder if you say a word about the tone of expression maybe related to that.
Absolutely. I think you just said it very well, Vince. I think you're onto something there, that LinkedIn does seem like a space because it is professional. And it is people who are, you're saying what your career field is. You're sort of presenting yourself in a way what you care about in a professional setting, that it does feel like a different space than what you're alluding to, right, with X, some of these other platforms where the Molotov cocktails are thrown, people can hide behind bots. And those are the platforms where, a lot of the polarization has been fomented in some of these other places, right? I don't necessarily totally blame the platforms, but I think the reality is X and other platforms have really fomented it. Whereas I do think you're onto it, right, Vince, that, LinkedIn is a place because the context is about, our jobs and what we do and how to, think about our jobs in a better way and strive higher, that, LinkedIn probably is a better source for such conversations. So I think you said it very well.
Okay. Before I ask another question, I just want to underscore for the viewers here, please feel free to drop a question into the chat. I see one that reaches back to the previous discussion. Maybe I'll wait for a minute to ask that one. But if anybody has a question for the Commons, please drop it in here now. I'll just ask, we are on the verge of an election and anything can happen. So I just wonder, do you have a sense of like, where does the Commons go if we go one direction or the other? Or do you just have to wait till the chips fall where they may?
Well, I think there's a couple pieces to that. Stacey alluded to it. As far as the Commons goes, our hunch is that, the polarization and divides aren't going to go away anytime soon, right? And for anyone who listened to the New York Times Daily this morning or probably saw an online version of the piece, there's already plans to contest the election if it goes in one direction, right? So the divides are likely to continue. So our hunch is that there's still going to be an audience and a craving for this content. So I don't think that so much depends on the results per se. This is more on the reporting side and less on maybe just this explicit comment side. One thing we're reporting out right now is trying to figure out what nonprofit leaders are doing and philanthropic leaders what are they doing in terms of scenario planning for the election results, right? Like what are the ways in which these leaders are planning to run their organizations? What decisions are they making now, regardless of the outcome in November? So, that whether that's safely in the commons, as a program, I don't know, but it's something I would say to expect from the Chronicle going forward. And Stacey, I don't know if you have any perspective to add, but feel free to.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, one of the conversations we had yesterday was how do we prepare for the likelihood that there's going to be violence of some sort? And our very audience is, going to be perhaps a target of some of those things. So, we need to talk about those issues. But one thing I want to stress about the comments is, although part of the fracturing of the country is over political divides, it's over so many other things. So, some of the examples of the stories we talked about, they're about generational differences, rural versus urban, and really looking at gender, other kinds of things. So we don't want it to be seen as only about politics because so much of philanthropy touches on so many other areas, and it's all of those divides that are hampering its effectiveness. So the reason we see this as a very long-term project is that the country is changing so much that we need to find ways to cover it.
And I'll just add in here that, I think the question of where's the line between the rest of the Chronicle's reporting and opinion pieces and the Commons is not entirely a bright one. So that's one of the things we talked about. Should there really even be a need for the Commons? Shouldn't the Chronicle, as the Chronicle of Philanthropy, just be doing that kind of work and not need a separate place called the Commons? We don't live maybe in that world, but that you could imagine 10 years from now that the whole Chronicle looks like the Commons. But I do think there's a need now, clearly, that to signal that we're working on this issue, addressing polarization and so forth. But I do think that is a question and a line to just be continually interrogated.
Yeah, or maybe the converse is equally true, that the Commons is only there because the Chronicle was already in a Commons space. Yeah. For sure. I will reach back now to the question that came about the fellowships, which is from Lori Kuhn. How does this fellowship effort interface with Press Forward, if at all, and to grow more trusted local news outlets?
So we started this before Press Forward happened, but we are looking now at ways that we can work locally and support some of the organizations that are working with Press Forward. So we would love to be able to go into some communities and partner in various ways. So we are exploring that for sure.
Great. And is there any way in which the fellowship actually feeds into the Commons? Have you seen any crosstalk in these two aspects of your work?
The projects that the fellows are working on this year don't lend themselves as much directly to it, but we're probably thinking about doing some kind of a special session that will feature this. One of the things we're also doing with the Commons is trying to make sure that some of the stories we're reporting that the Associated Press picks up and is able to spread in various ways. So, the more that we can do stories that get spread nationally, the more we can achieve our impact that we want to do there. So I think we need to help people understand why this is an important area to cover. And so it's something we're absolutely looking at. It doesn't fit perfectly. Some of the subjects that people are working on this year, for example, I'm really excited about. Flatwater Press in Omaha is looking at the impact of Warren Buffett and all of the zillionaires that are in Omaha and what happens as some of them are making succession plans and what happens to all these areas that have been dependent on philanthropy for a long time. How is that going to change? So that's an example of the kind of project that people are working on that, you know, wouldn't happen without this fellowship effort.
Yeah, and I think one thing I'll add too, and you know, whether I don't know if you'd call this an explicit tie-in between the Commons and the fellowship program, but I think the spirit of both programs is that we want perspectives that aren't just from the coast and aren't just from the, you know, the urban areas, right? That we're intentionally trying to, you know, hear from leaders and people on the ground and in places that are often underrepresented in media. So again, I don't know if that's a direct Commons and fellowship tie, but it's something that we're thinking about with both programs for sure.
Okay, there's a question from Rachel Kagan. Do all the stories in the Commons come from Chronicle of Philanthropy writers, or are they invited? Is there a way to pitch stories?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. There's a way to pitch stories. So I would say if it's a opinion or an essay, we have an opinion editor and we have an online landing page about how to pitch an opinion story. So certainly those are almost exclusively done by non-Chronicle Philanthropy writers. But then, yeah, even for reported pieces, we have worked with freelancers on pieces, not necessarily just staff members. So you know, my email is andrew.simon@philanthropy.com. You know, if anyone wants to send me a story, and you know, we also have some guidance on pitching on our website as well.
And not just for freelancing, but just story ideas. If somebody says, oh,
Yeah,
that's
absolutely.
always.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. All right. Well, we don't have a very talkative bunch out in the audience today, so we don't have a lot of questions, but I don't think there's any reason why we can't give ourselves a few minutes back before the hour is up. So I'll just say just a few things. One is that, you know, we're constantly looking at these kind of issues and really delighted to be able to share the specifics of the Chronicle's work today. But we have a monthly gathering for journalism funders, which we do on Zoom. The next one will be in September. We're taking off in August for that series. And then we're going to be doing our annual gathering of journalism funders at KQED in San Francisco. That'll be October 23rd and 24th. And we'll put a link up to that event as well. And so we would carry these conversations over in both of those environments. But in the meantime, I just want to thank all of our participants today: Steve Killar at the Arizona Republic, Stacy Palmer, my former boss. She got this whole thing started many years ago. Andrew Simon for joining us as well, the new editor at the Chronicle, and Faye Twersky from the Blank Foundation. Thank you all for illuminating this really important area of work with us. We really appreciate your contributions to our knowledge. We'll see you the next time. Thanks, everyone.